Well, happy Wednesday, everybody. Have you had a good day? Mine's been sort of eh. Um, Spent part of my lunchtime today consuming news, and I learned that COVID-19 cases are up and deaths from COVID-19 continue to rise, and that very few elected officials appear to be very worried about it, or at least not worried too much. So I also watched the Utah GOP gubernatorial primary debate last night and heard from most of the candidates anyway that police and the National Guard should have showed up earlier and kicked a lot of ass. So I guess what I'm saying is I believe we really have some giant sized leadership going on in government and from those who want to be in government. Um, that may not surprise anybody. I've also been reading a fair amount about the efforts to get rid of monuments to Confederate officers and change the names of our military bases that are named after Confederate leaders. I know how I've felt my whole life on the subject. I mean, I've never been able to understand how bases were named after traitors to the nation, or why we've tolerated statues to the likes of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and their ilk in the United States of America. It's never made any sense to me. But there are defenders of the base names and the monuments and statues, and lots of them. So, with that in mind, I was reading the Washington Post and came across an opinion piece by one of their regular columnists, David Von Drehle, who I'm not at all familiar with. Um, but he seemed to sum up the situation. So for today's first pages, I won't be reading from a book or story, but from a newspaper column that I think says what needs saying on the topic of the Confederate monuments and military base names. So here then is David Von Drehle's most recent column from the Washington Post, headlined "Renaming Military Bases is Not Erasing History, It's Erasing Propaganda." Fort Grant, named for the greatest American military strategist and general, a man who uniquely took the surrenders of three separate conquered armies at Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, and Appomattox Courthouse, did not survive long into the 1900s. No fort today is named for him. Fort Sherman, named for Ulysses S. Grant's partner in war and successor as head of the U.S. Army, was abandoned shortly after the Spanish-American War. Fort Thomas, named for the stalwart Virginian who, unlike Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, remained faithful to his soldier's oath while rivaling them both in military skill, closed in 1964. Several reserve units are all that remains of Fort Sheridan, named for the greatest 19th century U.S. cavalry general. And Farragut Naval Training Station, named for the indomitable admiral who gave the Navy some of its most stirring victories. Damn the torpedoes! Full speed ahead! Closed in 1966. Of soldiers and sailors loyal to the nation during the Civil War, only two are honored in the names of prominent military bases. Fort Meade in Maryland, home to the National Security Agency and other cyber warfare forces, commemorates George Meade, whose successful defense at Gettysburg left Lee 0 for 2 on Union soil. Fort Dix in New Jersey, now wrapped into Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst, recalls John A. Dix, a political general considered too elderly for combat. Fort McPherson, outside Atlanta, bore the name of a Union hero who served under Sherman. It was closed in 2011. By contrast, 10 active duty facilities memorialize Confederate leaders of widely differing competence, from the tragic figures of Lee and his sacrificial lamb George Pickett to bumbling Braxton Bragg and incompetent Leonidas Polk. A bipartisan move in Congress to rename these bases is opposed by two Senate whippersnappers, vying for future Republican presidential nominations. Josh Hawley of Missouri and Tom Cotton of Arkansas. Hawley denounced the project as, quote, attempting to erase that part of our history, end quote, but that's a weak defense and deserves no credence. What Hawley calls erasure is simply a sign of a healthy, vibrant nation busy making new history rather than languishing in the past. The story of a living people is constantly erased, revised and compressed to make room for new stories and a richer history. Union generals are not the only ones removed by history from center stage. In his day, Winfield Scott was praised by no less an authority than the Duke of Wellington, vanquisher of Napoleon at Waterloo, as, quote, the greatest living soldier, end quote. The military installation named in his honor was decommissioned in the 1980s. George Dewey, the highest ranking officer in the U.S. Navy history, has no naval base named after him. Time, like a great army, marches on. Furthermore, what would be erased by renaming the bases is precisely the opposite of history. The honors paid to these 10 men were part of a remarkably successful propaganda campaign, a deliberate and concerted attack on the history waged across generations. Long before Winston Churchill supposedly said it, Missouri politician George G. Vest claimed in 1891 that, quote, history is written by the victors, end quote. Not in the case of the Civil War. For the first 100 years, the history of America's bloodiest conflict was interpreted primarily through the lens of Southern apologists. They occupied positions of power at leading universities and dominated the writing of America's textbooks. Indeed, one, quote, lost cause, end quote, historian, Princeton's Woodrow Wilson, became president. In the White House, Wilson held a special screening of D.W. Griffith's influential film, The Birth of a Nation, a celebration of the Ku Klux Klan partly inspired by one of Wilson's books. Growing up in the 1960s, out west, not in the South, I was taught in school that Republican abolitionists were dangerous radicals, when in fact they were champions of human rights. I learned that Northern tariffs provoked the war, not Southern slavery. I learned that post-war attempts to bring a measure of equality to the former Confederacy were examples of corruption and carpetbagging. I learned that Ulysses S. Grant was a drunk butcher and a bad president, while Robert E. Lee was the epitome of military genius and personal integrity. We called that history class. It ran the gamut from highly debatable to maliciously false. The tragic irony of this propaganda machine was that the South bore the weight of it. The attempt to break up the United States through secession was a human and economic disaster for the South. The men who led that self-destructive project, men like the fire-eating Georgian Henry Benning and the relentless Texan John Bell Hood, did far more lasting damage to their own states, physically and psychologically, than they ever did to the North. Nostalgia for these men and their era left the region trapped and backward for a century, until the end of Jim Crow at last enabled the rise of a new South. Old times that never were are best forgotten. Look away, Dixieland.